today I'm going to talk about my thesis in Vietnam, looking at education with a focus on creativity. So this is Ken Robinson in one of the most popular TED Talks of all time. I think it's now reaching 15 million views on the TED website right now. So if you haven't watched the video, I encourage you guys to go check it out. But here's the main idea of his talk captured in a quote. Creativity now is as important in education as literacy, and we should treat it with the same status. Now, as I have really high respect for Sir Ken Robinson, and in fact his talk has helped inspire my own educational startup that I will talk about in a minute. Today in my thesis I will challenge his notion that an education that is supposedly fostering creativity will lead to more creative students. Through my research in Vietnam looking at the relationship between student creativity and learning environments, I argue that, first, an education that supposedly is more creativity fostering does not necessarily lead to more creative students. Secondly, regardless of learning environment, students still find ways to express their creativity through different channels and venues. Last but not least, and arguably the most important point in my thesis, the missing piece of the story, which I argue is a cultural framework that dictates learning beliefs and thus students' decisions to express their creativity. So I will go through my research to each and every point. Yeah, that's the first one. Okay. The Creative Kit project. So what I did, I started the project with simple questions. Are Vietnamese students creative, and to what extent? And what explains the difference in their creativity, and under what conditions the student creativity flourish? So in the summer of 2012, with the help of many friends, I created a platform in Vietnam called the Creative Kit project. And what we did in the program, so in a 6-day-long program, 30 students, 30 middle school students chosen from 90 different applications all over Hanoi, Vietnam, from 10 different middle schools, came together to engaged in an elaborative and collaborative process of building a project to improve their own schools. Here's some pictures from the project. And so besides being the sort of defining experience that really changing the way I look at my education at Brown as well as my education post-Brown, CKP Creative Kit project also provided me with data to look at student creativity through the ways they express their ideas. So in the process of applying to CKP, students have to answer different questions, one of which is, how do you define an ideal school? And the other one is, if you imagine in 20 years, you could have all the power in the world to do something to change it, like, what would it look like? So I then analyze students' expressions of ideas as a proxy for creativity according to 5 different components of creativity extrapolated from literature, such as how many ideas they have or how original the ideas are. I can go more deeply into the technical side of this in the Q&A if we have time. Just to give you an idea of an example, so here is a response from a student who scores very high on fluency, which is the number of ideas she was able to convey in one sentence. I'm going to read it to you. I like teachers who are attentive but not too dominant, knowledgeable but not know-it-all, especially personable and relatable. For the ones who treat you more like friends are those who are more likely, who you are more likely gravitate towards. So after coding, what I found is 2 groups of students who exude the largest difference in creativity, and these students happen to come from two very different schools with different educational models, which I shall call traditional model or traditional school, and experimental model or experimental school. So the natural next step for me was to find out whether there's something in their learning environment in these two schools that that differs student creativity, or it's just the nature of two self-selected groups. So here's what I did in the winter 2013. I went back to Vietnam, thanks to a grant from Brown, and what I did was 50 hours of research in each school, and I conducted a comparative case study in each of the schools, including interviews, classroom observations, and surveys. And here's what I found. Now, first of all, when I look at creativity, again, traditional school students continue to show higher level of creativity than experimental school students. They tend to be better communicators. They could elaborate their ideas very easily without me prompting every single sentence. And they also are able to find alternative ways to express their ideas, such as through drawing or even singing. But when I look at the learning environment, that is the interesting part of this, experimental school actually has more open learning environment, or their model fits better into the open learning environment framework that I drew from literature. And this is very puzzling because this kind of learning environment is supposedly more creativity fostering. So let me explain a little bit more about the difference. So if you look at this picture right here, this is a typical classroom in traditional school. What I found in this classroom is that teaching and learning are for the most part very teacher-centered. And the most common style of lectures is teachers' monologues, or teachers just talking to the students without really getting any feedback from them. And naturally, there's no interactions, or there are very few interactions between students and students and teachers. But when I look at experimental school, typical classroom, here is the most typical image that I found, which is teachers actually able to come up to every single student and attend to their individual needs. What else? They also are more likely to engage in teamwork. They also interact and ask questions more with the teachers. Another puzzling difference I found is the way the two schools define success, which I argue shapes the school culture and the school identity. Now, in traditional schools, the focus is on performance, grades, and getting the right answer. Whereas in experimental school, you can see the image I put here. In experimental school, students are not required to be top performers, and they, in some cases, are even allowed to make mistakes. Now, why is it important? Arguably, researchers have found that excessive focus on success, on one right answer, blocks creative thinking, because it doesn't allow students to think of possibilities and think of multiple ways of solving problems. So, in a nutshell, what I found is a paradox between, on one hand, a supposedly more open learning environment and more creativity fostering, and students' actual expressions of creativity. The second thing that I found is that the venues and channels through which students express creativity are also very interesting. What I would call the facets of informal creativity, or creativity that happens outside of students' classroom. Rebellious activities in class. Now, despite restricted learning environment, traditional school students turn out to be very creative rule breakers. And here's an image, I don't know if you can see that well, of a student reading a comic book in class, but also I found that they tend to collaborate with other students on homework. They tend to engage in free writing. They tend to just do other creative thinkings rather than coping with the boring classes. And they have perfected the skills so well that the teachers most of the time don't catch them at all. The second channel through which they express creativity is through the youth union. Now, the original purpose of the youth union is to celebrate party mandated events and activities. But what I found is that in traditional school, students actually regard the youth union as the hub for their student-run activities, such as this talent show right here. And in fact, a lot of the students that I taught during the Creative Kid project are actively engaged youth union members. So at this point, I was really puzzled and I asked myself, what is going on? And which brings me to my third point. That is cultural relevance. So what I found in my literature review, as well as through the process of going back and forth between what I found and what the previous research told me, is that most of the research done on creativity has been focusing on a few limited countries, such as the US or UK. Why is it a problem? Well, so according to proponents of culturally relevant sociology, culture dictates the way students shape their learning beliefs and thus their decisions to express creativity. So here, I put up here a very simplified version of creativity framework of learning processes. If you look at this slide, the Western learning process focuses much more on understanding the world or cultivating the mind with components such as active engagement, critical thinking, exploration, and self-expression. In short, those are the components that closely resemble components of creativity. Whereas if you look at this side, the Eastern learning processes focusing much more on self-perfection with components that require students to be more virtuous and more studious learners rather than creative learners. However, it doesn't mean that students are not creative. It just means that in the space and in the formal classroom, they don't see the formal classroom as the appropriate venue to express their creative channel. However, because of the heavy emphasis on teachers and on exams, they have more incentive to find other channels and other ways to express creativity elsewhere. Now, this is my last slide. So why is all this important? I argue that ultimately, my research is a plea for a more culturally relevant solution to the problem of ineffective education in the Vietnamese context, not only for Vietnamese educators, but also for Western educators. As someone who has studied in both of the learning context and education, I find it very dangerous to assume that what is true in one culture might also be true in another culture. And as Sir Ken Robinson's talk is approaching 16 million views right now, and as well as the spread of many Western ideologies in education in the Eastern context, my research calls for a more nuanced way to engage creativity that is more in line with the very culture that frames the conception of creativity in the first place.